Okay, welcome everybody to our screencast of the lymphatic system. This is the first part of a two-part PowerPoint on the lymphatic system and immunity. I like to cover both these systems together because the immune system is the only system in the human body that's not organ-based. It's a cellular-based system, and those cells are housed in the lymphatic system. So when we talk about these two systems, the lymphatic system will become the system that we'll talk about as far as anatomy is concerned, and the immune system we'll talk about with regard to physiology. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, by way of introduction, I'd like to talk a little bit about microbes before we get into this. And here's the reason. Many of you I know probably have not had a microbiology class yet. If some of you have, this will be a little redundant, but that's okay. We want to make sure everybody is up and understands this basic background. So what are microbes? Microbes are tiny organisms that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. So as their name suggests, you need a microscope in order to be able to see them. Many of these microbes are pathogens, and they cause problems that your body has to deal with. The immune system has to deal with. So not all microbes cause problems, though. So whenever we talk about microbes, and any time I've taught a microbiology class, I like to start out by classifying microbes into one of three groups. Just to give you a little baseline on the microbes and a little bit of background. You probably won't find this classification system anywhere in a textbook, but I think it'll help you understand a little bit better what we're talking about here. So let's take a look at it. So the first group that I like to classify the microbes into is the good group. Good microbes includes those microbes that we can use for the production of foods. Things like yogurt, cheese, bread, beer, wine, sauerkraut. Those are all made using knowledge that we've learned about these good microbes, ones that don't cause human diseases, yet we can harness what we learn from them and use them to do something good. A second group of good microbes are the decomposers. Decomposers cause rotting. They recycle things into the environment, and so they're important to us. And then the final group of good microbes that I'd like to talk about are the microbes that we use in biotechnology. And we're talking here primarily about pharmacology. Pharmacology is the study of drugs and medicines that are used to treat human disease. So we learn about, let's say, certain types of bacteria, and we find out that certain types of bacteria have the ability to absorb DNA from their surrounding environment. Now, with today's technology, we know what part of the DNA inside human cells is responsible for the manufacture of insulin. So let's say we have a person who's a diabetic, and the reason they're diabetic is because their body doesn't produce sufficient amounts of insulin anymore. Well, we can use bacteria that have been genetically altered to produce human insulin, and we can use that human insulin to treat their diabetes. A good example of how we can harness biotechnology to help treat human disease. Well, the next class of microbes then are what I refer to as the bad microbes. These bad microbes include bacteria and viruses that cause human infectious diseases, what we call pathogens. So the pathogens I classify as the bad microbes. The third group of microbes are what I call the ugly microbes. They're pathogens as well, but they're particularly virulent or strong, and they cause disease very quickly, and they can result in the death of an individual very quickly as well. These would include diseases like AIDS, which is caused by the HIV virus, Ebola, which is in the news a lot these days, and Salmonella, which is a type of bacterial infection that causes food poisoning. All right, with that in mind, let's take a look at the two main pathogens that there are. The first of these are the bacteria. bacteria, we need to study them, and we'll take a look at them so that whenever we look at the immune system, we can understand how the immune system is designed to fight off or ward off these pathogens and clear them from our bodies. So let's take a look at these bacteria. First of all, bacteria are prokaryotic. That means these are bacteria are cells, and that these cells, however, do not have a nucleus. But because they are cells, they have the ability to live and reproduce independent of host cells. In other words, they can live and reproduce inside our body independent of our body cells. Well, if that's the case, how do they cause disease? The answer, it's one of two ways. First, they can cause disease by multiplying inside hosts. So what happens is the bacteria enter our body, and bacteria look for the perfect conditions in order to be able to grow. 4 conditions are needed for bacteria to grow. They need darkness, they need warmth, they need moisture, and they need light. Or excuse me, not light. They need, they need darkness, moisture, warmth, and food. Okay, so they need a food source. Okay, so let's take a look at the 2 main pathogens that your body has to deal with. The first of these is the bacteria. And here's a bacterium right here. Okay, that's a typical bacterium. Now, when we take a look at that typical bacterium, that bacterium is prokaryotic. That means that it is a cell. So bacteria are cells, but because it's prokaryotic, it does not have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. But because it is made up of, because bacteria are made up of cells, they can live and reproduce independently of host cells. That means that they can live inside your body, but they don't have to live inside the cells of your body. They can live and reproduce right alongside the cells of your body. So how do bacteria then cause disease? Well, they cause disease by 2 main ways. One is by multiplying and growing inside the host organism, that is to say, inside your body. And when they grow and multiply inside your body, they compete with your cells for the resources of your body. And they outcompete those cells. They hog up all the resources. Your cells don't get the resources they need to live and reproduce and grow inside your body and do the things they're there to do. And so eventually they run out of resources and they die. A second way that bacteria cause disease is through the production of toxins or poisonous substances. So these are chemicals that bacteria release as a part of their physiology into the tissues that surround them. And these poisons or toxins can cause damage to the cells of those tissues. The other main pathogen that we talk about are the viruses. Viruses, unlike bacteria, are non-cellular. We say that they're non-cellular particles. They don't have all the components that cells typically have. As a matter of fact, viruses consist of mainly 2 parts. They consist of a protein coat that also has a nucleic acid core. So when we take a look at viruses, here we can see in purple the protein coat, and here underneath the protein coat we can see the nucleic acid core. Now that nucleic acid core is made up of either DNA or RNA, but never both. Now those are the 2 main parts, but the virus, may also have some other components, like, for example, this membrane right here that this particular virus has, and it actually got that membrane from its host cell that it infected. Okay, so viruses, because they are non-cellular, they don't have the machinery to be able to carry out reproduction. So they have to use the machinery of cells in order to be able to reproduce. So viruses literally have to get inside cells, and they live inside those cells. They take over those cells, and they tell the cells, stop doing what you're doing and do what I tell you to do now, which is make more viruses. So eventually, the cell either dies from the accumulation of viruses inside, or the cell dies because it doesn't do what it's normally supposed to do and take care of itself, and it just makes viruses until it just basically runs out of gas and can't make them anymore. Okay, so with that background, we're ready to move on and talk about the lymphatic system. Let's begin by taking a look at what the main components of the lymphatic system are. These components include lymph vessels, lymph nodes, the tonsils, the thymus, and the spleen. Here's an inset that shows the location of each of those different structures. We'll be taking a look at this picture a lot as we continue to move through our look at the lymphatic system. But here we can see the thymus gland right here. We can see various lymph nodes. The lymph nodes tend to have a high accumulation in the areas of the groin. Here we can see more in the axillary region, which they're very highly concentrated in. That's the armpit. Okay, and we can also see some other components. We can see some lymph vessels like the right lymphatic duct here, and we can see the thoracic duct here. Here we see the spleen, and up here the tonsils. So we'll be referring to this a lot as we continue through our discussion of the lymphatic system. Okay, next up, let's take a look at some of the functions of the lymphatic system. One function of the lymphatic system is to return tissue fluid to the blood. Now, we kind of talked about this in the cardiovascular system when we went over capillary exchange. Recall what we said was that on the arterial side of a blood vessel, water squirts out, and then that water is recovered on the venous side of the blood vessel. The water squirts out on the arterial side because of blood pressure. The water is recovered on the venous side because of osmotic pressure. But is all the water recovered on the osmotic side? The answer to that question is no. More water squirts out than can be recovered on the venous side of the capillary bed. So what happens to that excess water? Well, that's where the lymphatic system is important. The lymphatic system, remember, there are those lymph capillaries that have blunt ends that kind of are threaded around through and work just like the fingers of my hand. They're threaded around through the capillary beds, and they recover the excess water to prevent swelling from occurring. Okay, another function of the lymphatic system is to transport fats from the digestive system back into the circulatory system. We'll be taking a look at that in more detail as we go along. Next up, and this is where our main focus is going to be throughout the rest of this discussion, is that the lymphatic system produces, maintains, and distributes lymphocytes which are needed for defense against the pathogens. So the lymphocytes are major components of the immune system. Remember, I said the immune system is a cellular-based system, and the cells that we're talking about here are those lymphocytes, primarily lymphocytes. Okay? So the lymphatic system is where those lymphocytes are produced, and where they are maintained, and where they are distributed throughout the body from. Okay, next up, let's take a look at the difference between tissue fluid and lymph, because we're going to be talking about that a lot as we go along. Let's begin with tissue fluid. Tissue fluid is defined as the fluid that surrounds the body cells. Okay, it is derived from plasma. So on the arterial side of the capillary bed, when the water squirts out, it bathes the cells. Remember I talked about that little puddle of water. That puddle of water with a lot of nutrients and other things that we've talked about in it is what we refer to as the tissue fluid. Tissue fluid consists then of water primarily, but it also contains nutrients, electrolytes, remember those are positively or negatively charged ions, and oxygen. It also contains varying amounts of hormones that are secreted by the endocrine system, enzymes, which are not activated right now, but will have the ability to catalyze chemical reactions, and various waste products that are produced by the cells. Now, once the tissue fluid is recovered from the cells back into the lymphatic system, it's no longer referred to as tissue fluid, but now is referred to as lymph. So once the water essentially gets recovered on the venous side of the capillary bed, that is still goes back and becomes part of the plasma, but the water that's recovered by those lymph capillaries now is referred to as lymph. Lymph is usually colorless, but after mills, it may have a high fat content, and as a result, it may be creamy appearing due to that high lipid or fat content. All right, next up, let's take a look at the structure of lymph vessels. Now, structurally, lymph vessels are very similar to veins. They are thin-walled like veins are, and so they're collapsible if they don't have any lymph inside them. And the larger ones, just like veins, also have one-way valves. The organization is very similar to veins. You start out at the lymph capillaries, which are very similar to the blood capillaries, but lymph capillaries are larger and tend to be much more permeable than what the blood capillaries are. They also originate in the body tissues and have blunt ends. So again, just like my fingers would be, they would be like the lymph capillaries. My fingers, each one of my fingers is not attached to another end. So when we talk about the blood capillaries, you have an arterial side and you have a venous side. But with the lymph capillaries, you just have blunt ends. Now, each of those lymph capillaries then drains into a lymph vessel. The lymph vessels, the smaller lymph vessels, will drain lymph from those lymph capillaries. Those smaller lymph vessels will then form tributaries to form larger lymph vessels. Eventually, the larger lymph vessels will come together to form tributaries to form the two largest lymph vessels in the body, two large collecting ducts. Before we go on to take a look at those two large collecting ducts, this picture just kind of reviews what we're talking about. So here we can see in green the lymph capillaries and how they're kind of intertwined with the capillary beds, the blood cardiovascular capillary beds, but we can see how they have blunt ends. Over here on this side, we have an enlargement of a lymph vessel. We can see the lymph vessel has thin walls and it has one-way valves, and so that keeps the lymph moving in a single direction, back toward the heart. Eventually, the lymph is going to be dumped into those two large collecting ducts just outside the heart and return to the blood circulatory system. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at those two large collecting ducts. The first one we have to take a look at is the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is the largest lymph vessel in your body. So just like the aorta is the largest artery in your body, and just like the superior and inferior vena cava are the two largest veins in your body, thoracic duct is the largest lymph vessel in your body. The thoracic duct drains lymph from the entire body, below the diaphragm, and the left half of the body above the diaphragm. So the thoracic duct is going to empty into the base of the left subclavian vein then. So eventually all the drainage system of the thoracic duct the thoracic duct is going to take all that lymph and it's going to return it to the blood via the left subclavian vein. On the other hand, the second collecting duct is the right lymphatic duct. The right lymphatic duct drains the right side of the body above the diaphragm. It is eventually going to empty lymph into the base of the right subclavian vein. Now let's go back to our diagram to take a look at this. So here is the thoracic duct, and we can see the thoracic duct coming up right here, dorsal to the heart, so it's coming up behind the heart. It comes up, it loops around, and eventually enters, passes the lymph back into this vein right here, which is the left subclavian vein. So we get that because that's the left side of the body. Sub means below, clavian, the clavicle, so it's below the clavicle, so it's this large vein below the clavicle on the left side of the body. Thoracic duct dumps the lymph into there. Okay. On the other hand, the right lymphatic duct, here we can see the right lymphatic duct and how it connects. This would be the right subclavian vein here. Okay. So let me do a drawing here to help you understand this now. So if we take a line and draw a line right down through the center of the body and extend it from superior to inferior, and then draw a second line across at about the line of, or at the across at the level of the diaphragm. Now we can divide the body into right and left halves and upper and lower regions. So if we talk about the thoracic duct, then everything on the right side of the body here above the diaphragm, and that's going to include the arm, and the entire body below the diaphragm, this whole area, is going to be drained by the right lymphatic duct. On the other hand, let's change our color here. The red is the drainage system for the thoracic duct. Now the right lymphatic duct is going to drain everything that we see here in blue. The left half of the body, or the right half of the body above the diaphragm, and that's all, but it is going to include the arm. So we'll just draw all that down there. Okay, everything, all the lymph from the right arm and the right chest and head area is going to drain back into the right subclavian vein via the right lymphatic duct. Everything else above the diaphragm on the right side, or the left side of the body, and the entire body below the diaphragm is going to be drained by the thoracic duct. Okay. Now, as a side note here, I do want to mention that you may find out that some people do not have a right lymphatic duct. If an individual doesn't have a right lymphatic duct, what does that mean? Does that mean they're going to swell up and die? No. If you don't have a right lymphatic duct, and some people don't, as I said, then there will be other ducts that will drain into the right subclavian vein and return the lymph to the right subclavian vein when the right lymphatic duct is absent.